Growing up, I spent many summers in the Ozarks. At an early age, I fell in love with its rich history of lawmen and bandits. Over the years, I've learned much more about the Ozarks, including its dark and mysterious lore. Join me, Blasky, as I dive into this lore, the myths, superstitions, and urban legends of the Ozarks. This is Ozark Mountain Lore. Most of us at some point in our lives have looked to the stars to catch a glimpse of something shooting across the sky. You might think it's a meteor, disappearing as quickly as it appeared. Or maybe it's space debris just burning up while re-entering the atmosphere. But for a brief moment, there's that little thought that creeps in from the dark corners of your mind. The thought that beckons the question, was it aliens? For generations, mankind has looked to the stars, wondering what could be out there beyond our sky. Is there life dwelling on other planets far from our galaxy? And a more important question, have they been here? Many have claimed to have seen unidentified flying objects or UFOs all across the world, and the Ozarks are no different. On this episode of Ozark Mountain Lore, we look to space to explain two of the most interesting tales of abduction that left the world wondering about the existence of intelligent life on other planets. We're going to look into the story of Buck Nelson, a simple farmer turned space traveler after a chance encounter with extraterrestrials, and a tale of a man whose encounter with alien life riddled him with horrific nightmares that felt all too real. The story of Terry Lovelace and his abduction at Devil's Den. Starting with Buck Nelson, one of the first people in the Ozarks to have claimed to have been abducted. As stated before, he was just a simple farmer who only had a 6th grade education. He was born in Colorado back in 1895 and made his way to Mountain View later in his life, where he eventually settled on a plot of land where he lived all by himself. Buck could usually be seen every Monday morning waiting for the bank to open, then just periodically throughout the week. Friendly, but keeping to himself. Buck's simple life would turn upside down one summer night in July of 1954, when things at his quiet little farm erupted into a chorus of loud and frightened animals. Buck, trying to fix the interference on his radio, dropped it to run outside to see what all the commotion was about. And that's when he saw it. A round object floating directly above his head. Buck tried to focus on it with his bad eyes, and that's when it hit him. A beam of bright light shot out from the object, knocking Buck to the ground. He would later go on to describe this light as being brighter and hotter than our sun. You would think a light this bright and intense would have seared his skin, but on the contrary, Buck claimed that many of his physical issues had been cured. His vision repaired. His lower back pain was gone, and his other ailments no longer there. He couldn't believe it. But before he knew it, the round object took off back into the sky. According to Buck, this was not the last time he would be visited by the object. Buck claimed that some months later, the object would return to his farm, and this time it spoke to him. In Buck Nelson's book, My Trip to Mars, the Moon, and Planet A, that he would later publish recalling his experiences, he wrote, "They said they would like to land in the back pasture where there was a spring. They wanted to know if I would allow them to land many times if necessary. They didn't land this time and only talked for a few minutes. Then they bid me a goodbye and said, 'We'll see you again,' which Buck said they did in April of 1955. This time, the craft would land in the back pasture as requested. To Buck's surprise, what exited the craft wasn't little green men or a large black-eyed, gray-skinned creature with a bulbous head. Instead, it was a young man that went by the name of Bucky, and instead of some kind of spacesuit, he was wearing purple overalls. With him, his co-pilot Bob, and a dog that weighed well over 300 pounds. Bucky and Bob told Buck to go clean himself up and that they would take him with them, but only if he would tell the world of what he had learned upon his return. Buck agreed, and the three of them boarded the craft and took off to which he claimed was the Moon, Mars, and Venus. Buck's account of Venus, Mars, and the Moon are very different to what we know today. According to Buck, the Moon was a mining colony, and Mars, well, he detailed it as being not much different than the Ozarks, and that the land was being used as a farming colony. Everything was powered by electricity and magnets. There was no wars and no need for police. And they even had their own version of the 10 Commandments. After his visit, Buck returned to his home in Mountain View. Bucky would go on and give Buck a stark warning, saying that he had seen many civilizations destroyed again and again with atomic power. He would continue on by saying humans' use of nuclear power was being misused and would destroy everybody once again. And with that, they left Buck's farm, and Buck set out to keep his promise and began telling the world about his new space brothers. He started out by writing an article about what he had learned from his companions and published it in the Springfield Leader and Press, calling for the world to give up atomic power. His stories began to gain popularity amongst those looking for evidence of life on other planets. He was asked to speak about his experiences at conferences and even became a prominent figure in the UFO community. He spoke at lectures and numerous radio interviews and even claimed to have captured a photograph of the space visitors in 1956. Throughout the late 50s and the 1960s, hundreds would gather to his farm every year, like a convention of sorts. At these conventions and during these interviews, people would ask Buck if he had any proof other than his photo. Buck said that he didn't have any evidence, but he did leave behind a tiny American flag on each planet and the moon. Buck even claimed that at one point the US government took an interest in his stories and picked him up for some questioning. The popularity of Buck and his conventions began to dwindle and eventually ended. Just a few years later, Buck's house would end up tragically burnt to the ground, and Buck would just disappear. There's 3 different sources I found that gave 3 different dates to his passing. One is 1973, the other 1977, and the final one, 1982. How do we know that Buck didn't just leave for the stars and just never came home? Now, I will admit, Buck's story seems more like an adventure filled with wild stories of a mining colony on the moon and a utopian society on Venus. But not everyone who has claimed to have been abducted by extraterrestrials come back with the same story of an adventure. Some come back with a horrifying account that will stick with them for the rest of their lives. They are left with nightmares and the feeling of being alone. It's not like you could just run and tell somebody you've been abducted by aliens and expect everybody to treat you like a rational person. A sad fact that Terry Lovelace learned at a very early age. Terry's story is one that he has kept very close to the chest for most of his life for fear of losing his career and his friends in the process. For this story, I pulled most of my material directly from Terry's book, My Incident at Devil's Den, a true story by Terry Lovelace. His book detailed his famous abduction at Devil's Den, but also revealed his long history with visitors from another world. Terry Lovelace is a retired attorney and former assistant attorney general. He has a law degree from the University of Michigan and served in the U.S. Air Force. A seemingly normal person by all accounts, not one you would think would be harboring stories of aliens stealing him away in the middle of the night. Terry's story starts at the age of 8. He wrote a poem about 4 sinister-looking monkeys who had kidnapped him in the middle of the night. The poem was inspired by encounters he said to have had with 4 monkey men, all with the same face that featured a large grin that made him feel very uneasy. They each had yellow eyes and a long tail. He could never tell exactly what the monkeys' intentions were, except they kept saying, "Terry, everything's okay. Won't you come and play with us?" He would often awake to faint voices in his room repeating this line, although it did take him some time to decipher what exactly they were saying at first. He said that when they spoke, he could hear their voices in his head, even though their mouths weren't moving. The monkeys would begin to surround Terry, now with their faces starting to look more angry and more menacing. What exactly were they going to do? Suddenly, Terry would let out a loud scream, loud enough to wake the entire house. His father would assure him that what he saw was just a bad dream. But Terry wasn't too sure. It felt all too real. And what he couldn't shake was the feeling that maybe he had gone with them once before. As Terry got older, the visits stopped and eventually the nightmares. That was until one day when Terry was playing in his backyard and saw a dark cloud casting a shadow heading his way. Not unheard of, but it was the shape of the cloud that left him puzzled. It was perfectly round. That's when he looked up and directly above him was a large object floating just 50 feet above his head, making absolutely no noise. He tried to concentrate to see if he could find any markings to identify it, or anything that would indicate an entry point into the craft, but he saw nothing. Just a perfectly smooth surface that left him captivated at first. He recalled feeling that the air was being statically charged. Everything seemed just so quiet. Then, without warning, it just flew away at an incredible speed. Without realizing it, Terry found himself screaming while the neighbors watched on. His mother took him inside, but Terry said that he couldn't stop looking at the sky. He told his family what he had saw, but once again, just like the monkeys, no one believed him. Was it just the overactive imagination of a little boy caught up in the hysteria of aliens and spacecrafts of the time? Or was Terry being singled out by alien life forms from another world? Like the other encounters, they were followed by another long slew of nightmares, this time about shadowy figures surrounding his house and him in an attempt to take him away. Was Terry being abducted again and again? Or was this just a reoccurring fear that continues to plague him? Sadly, things would continue to happen to Terry, and he learned to keep things to himself, knowing that most people would just think that he was crazy. Then, in 1977, that's when the abduction that he is most known for took place. During his time in the Air Force, Terry was an EMT stationed at Whiteman Air Force Base just outside of Kansas City. One weekend, Terry and his fellow airman Toby were on leave and decided to get off base just for a couple of days. They made their way south to Devil's Den State Park, located in Washington County in the northwest portion of Arkansas. They were looking for a more secluded place, away from the public park. They made a campfire right off a bluff and were enjoying the night air when they both spotted a blue light heading right for them. Terry said what he saw that night was a ship the shape of a triangle that looked to be several stories tall. He wrote in his book, they slowly rotated on an axis, all the while maintaining their triangular configuration. The points of light grew brighter and they crawled upward. The triangle formation grew larger and sped up a little, blocking out entire fields of the stars as it climbed. It came to a halt directly over our heads. It was like someone had cut a giant triangle in the sky. What happened next was something he was only able to remember bits and pieces of. But one thing was certain, it really happened. Terry would spend many years trying to block things out, keeping things close to the chest, telling only his wife of what had happened. Fast forward to 2012, a married man with a career and a seemingly normal life. Being the health-conscious person that he is, Terry would go jogging to stay in shape. One thing that he would notice is that when he would hit the 2-mile mark, his knee would just go numb. That was odd. Why only after 2 miles? It would always happen right above the right knee. Then one night after jogging, Terry found himself in terrible pain. Unable to put any pressure on his leg, he went to the emergency room to have it checked out. The doctor took x-rays to see if there was any bone fractures of any kind. Turns out, it was something very odd. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. A tiny shard, no bigger than a fingernail, appeared on his x-ray. The technician taking the scans asked Terry if he had any shrapnel in his leg. He replied no, since he had never been deployed to combat. The doctor also saw what the radiologist saw. He said that the object had symmetry to it, and it was definitely man-made. Man-made? Or more like manufactured? But by who? What made things even more puzzling was the fact that there was no entry mark, no scar, nothing. How could that be? But that wasn't all. The radiologist showed an alternate view of one of the scans. Terry wrote in his book that the radiologist said, if you look at the lateral view below your knee, there's a flower petal arrangement of an object the same density as bone. These round artifacts are flat disc, so in the formal view, they're barely visible. Could it be that in his abduction in 1977, that he was implanted with some kind of device? I think it's easy to say that someone would be at a loss for words after learning about such news. But what did it mean? And where did it possibly come from? The doctors opted not to remove it, considering that they weren't sure it was the cause of his pain. They wrote it off as what they call a Baker's cyst, a fluid sac behind the knee. Confused and curious by the hospital's findings, Terry began to research other stories similar to his. To his shock, there were several accounts that were just like his. Are aliens picking people up, tagging them, and then releasing them back into the wild like some strange interstellar conservation project? Unfortunately, the trip to the ER had awoken terrible nightmares that had been laying dormant for some years. Terry noticed, though, that these nightmares seemed to be happening in some kind of order, like he was reliving an old memory. His wife encouraged him to journal all of his nightmares. By doing so, he had learned that he was reliving the night at Devil's Den. And that's where I'm going to leave Terry's story. If you are someone who finds these kind of encounters intriguing, I recommend that you read his story for yourself. Things do take a turn and go down a very interesting rabbit hole. But looking at what we know so far, it's hard to argue that all of this was just in Terry's head. I mean, sure, it's easy to dismiss a child as simply having an overactive imagination, but an adult? And with a witness? How can Terry and Toby both be imagining things? It's one of those Ozark mysteries we may never solve. And there it is, two of the most famous and intriguing stories of alien abductions you will find in the Ozarks. One, a man who saw the stars as a chance to explore. The other, a vast and dark place filled with beings with questionable intentions looking to return to visit their favorite subject. Remember these stories the next time you look to the sky and see something darting across the stars. It could just be a meteor, or maybe extraterrestrials planning to visit our little blue planet. On next week's episode of Ozark Mountain Lore, another collection of horrific and ghostly urban legends just in time for Halloween. For more content, follow Around the Ozarks on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and X, or go to AroundTheOzarks.com and subscribe to the daily newsletter so you don't miss when new episodes drop.